My title could be summarized in a way, my whole thesis could be summarized as the laws of physics trump everything. And any enterprise in conflict with them is doomed to failure. There is nothing ethical about the laws of physics, they just are. So, here's the most basic fact of our biophysical life. Our home, as far as we know, the home of the only life there is in the universe, and therefore, in my view, infinitely precious, because I don't know what the ethics would be on a place like Jupiter. However, certain things follow from the fact that it is above all visibly finite, namely that no physical thing can grow indefinitely. That means that both growth in population and growth in consumption of resources per person will definitely stop at some point. And the question is not whether, but how. I could spin you a dozen scenarios about how economic growth will stop, all equally improbable, but at least having the merit of being possible, unlike the prevailing view of ever more people each consuming ever more stuff forever on this finite ball of rock here. But certainly with population there are only two ways to stop. It's caused by more births than deaths. It can be ended either by fewer births or by more deaths. And that means either the humane way, by contraception backed by policy, programs for women's empowerment and education, and incentives to use it and so on, or to wait for nature to take its course, which it will in the traditional Darwinian way through famine, disease and predation, or in our case, war. Here's a picture of the history of the Earth, and just draw your attention to the age of the Earth. Look at the timelines. 4.5 billion years. That little thing at the end is this bit. There's the dinosaurs, very successful species, lasted a long time, far longer than we will probably. Here's more recently apes and men. Last common ancestor with the chimpanzees, a mere 7 million years ago. Very, very recent. We're incredibly recent upstarts. And here, down here, there's a gap in the narrative because it ignores all the hunter-gatherer time of Homo sapiens sapiens back here in the Mesolithic and Paleolithic. But here we are with agriculture in the Neolithic. And you see, for the first time ever, having been a natural species kept in balance with habitat by natural forces, population starts to grow. It grows very slightly. Here's the Black Death. It turns sharply exponential with the Industrial Revolution. And here it is now, going on up to, that's the lifetime of our present Queen, but it's nearly my lifetime. Here is the range projected by the UN for 2050. It's a range of 2.6 billion, which was more than the entire population of the planet when I was 10. So anyone who tells you that it's obviously going to be just as easy, to feed a whole planet full, 2.6 billion, more or fewer people, is clearly delusionary. And here's the possibility then of it emulating. It happens to match, this curve matches the brown-green algal bloom. So I've merely projected that forward in a dotted line full of question marks as to the common phenomenon in nature, reindeer in Greenland or another, of slow booms and rapid busts. Here's the Anthropocene, peak everything, whatever it is, damming rivers, water, McDonald's, population and so on, they're all going the same way. The exponential curve you recognize. So it's an overcrowded world now, and that raises an ethical question, especially for rich people having large families, or even poor people. If you're a rich person having a large family, the question is, who are you pushing off the plate? And I'll mention a lot of different ethical incidental questions, not related directly to population size as we go along. And it's very much not just a matter for Bangladesh or for Nigeria, very much one for the developed countries, the ethics around all those emissions and the embodied energy in all those motor cars. And what they're doing to the poor people of the world is, of course, a major issue, much debated at the climate talks.
Where's that?
That's Los Angeles. A motorway outside Los Angeles, where my son lives. Where I shall be in 3 weeks' time. Burning fuel to get there. And here is London, a familiar situation. We are an overcrowded country. The British population is already, England's the most overcrowded country in Europe. 80% of us want a smaller population than we have now. We think it's overcrowded. Our ecological footprint, which I could come to later if there's time, says that we're already 300% ecologically overshot. 300% of the renewable ecological services we rely on to live are coming from other people or from natural capital. And I should have shown earlier in the picture of the, forgive me, whoops, that one, simply the way in which that huge curve, that exponential curve, was fueled by the Industrial Revolution, which was based on discovering all that stored solar energy from scores of millions of years of sunlight turning into fossil fuels and using them up in a very short time, being clever enough to extract them, to extract all, to exploit the other natural capital in the world and loot the lot, really, from the forest to the fisheries to the biodiversity, to the soils, the water and the minerals, but also, unfortunately, remaining stupid enough to think of it as income rather than capital. Sorry, back, where were we? We were here. Here is the range. The point is that the UK population projections, like all population projections, are variables and not givens. And some people think that the UN medium thing is just what is fated to happen. It's bullshit. Of course it's not. We can influence that. And in fact, in the third world particularly, population is highly susceptible to policy intervention at very modest cost. You can see the difference here. At the moment, our projections for 2050 are somewhere between 7 and 46 more Manchesters. And 80% of us don't want any more people at all. So there's a question there around sustainability and so on. Here's what is all this doing to the life support system of the planet? Well, here's climate change, a very close correlation, somewhat meretricious because the poorest are not emitting any more. They're multiplying in number, and the richest have, again, stopped increasing their per capita emissions, but are pretty high already. Most of that growth is the emerging economies, where, of course, people are getting richer and in the process necessarily employing more and more energy slaves, which is what being rich is all about, instead of having to do all the work yourself. What's other things I could have put up? A lot of pictures of the dried up riverbed. I just mentioned the incipient conflicts brewing in the treaty frameworks governing the catchment of, say, the Nile, the Euphrates, the Mekong, the Brahmaputra. Dried up riverbeds are a common phenomenon, and it's not by chance that the ethical questions or the military questions of whether Ethiopia builds another bloody great dam on the Blue Nile, in response to such plans, the Egyptian High Command leaked inadvertently, their plans to destroy this dam should it be put in place. There are looming conflicts with potential for suffering from this phenomenon of finite amounts of water being divided among ever-increasing numbers of people. I could have gone on with deforestation, soil erosion and so on. Let's come to biodiversity. This is just a guesstimate. In 1750, roughly 12% of the biomass, the weight of all mammals in the world, was humans and their animals, and now it's 98%. And this raises, obviously, the interspecies ethical question of whether other animals are merely instrumental for the welfare of humans, or whether they have any rights to existence on their own, or any special position in the world. And where mammal populations are doing well, and here's, of course, the wildebeest migration on the Serengeti, wonderful site, they're doing well for two reasons. The first being that people are kept out, and the second is that they are kept in balance with their habitat by natural process by their top predator. It's very interesting, the population growth curves of both wildebeest in the Serengeti and lions are sequential sine curves, like any steady-state, sustainable ecosystem tends to be. Life is a sine curve. Great saying. And here are some poor women from Niger, as it happens, place with the highest fertility rate in the world, who got very little in the way of water, or soil, or biodiversity, or much else. The average fertility rate, total fertility rate in Niger is 7. It's the highest of the world, as I've said. And so I don't know what these women's life expectancy is, but I doubt if it's very high. If they had 7 children each, so there were 88 people in that picture instead of 11, how would you rate their life expectancy? I don't know, but I shouldn't think it was great. Let's look at the economics of population growth. hunger is the most dramatic example of economic failure, and here's a very precise correlation between the growth in hunger and population growth rates. It says exactly what theory would predict with amazing accuracy. And here's a little cartoon, a food train, world food supply systems. I think I can, I hope I can, oh man, I hope I can, as it puffs up the population curve. Here's the implications for instability, for violence. Those are the World Food Index peaks very recently, and they happen to coincide with outbreaks of civil disturbance in all sorts of places. When George W. Bush decided to do this great green gesture of converting half his maize crop to biofuels, of course the price of food went up around the world and people rioted. And it's very interesting when it comes to that MI5 had this famous quote, every city is just 9 meals from anarchy. And we'll all civilized, we'll all wait patiently in a queue for bread, provided we're confident that the bakery will be restocked if it runs out. But if there are only 11 loaves left and you're number 12, how much respect will you give the little old lady in front of you? And here's a very familiar sight. We've all seen lots of people with AKs, and we've seen lots of hungry people. I've never seen a picture on my television screen of a person with an AK looking hungry. It's the ones without the AKs who look hungry. So at least this poor kid, whatever else his prospects, has a meal ticket to the front of any food queue going. And so here's the perfect storm that our last chief scientist, John Beddington, foreshadowed. Population growth, climate change, and peak oil, by which he means reducing energy return on energy invested, leading to ever greater food, water, and energy insecurity. And here's a slide I got from his predecessor, David King, formerly of the city, who has this picture of whatever your problem, whatever it is, population makes it harder to solve. From conflict and terrorism to climate change, biodiversity, and everything else. So here's a conclusion that I regard as absolutely inescapable, and flowing logically from the physical stuff I've been talking about. Stable or reducing populations are an essential, but of course far from sufficient, condition for any biophysically sustainable society or economy. So how do we get there? How do we stabilize? Well, here's a picture of some bunnies. I'm only going to say this one more time. Our only chance is self-control. We are fortunately not bunnies. Here's an obvious conclusion. We have the pill. It is brilliant. It is wonderful. We can have artificial birth control to match the artificial death control from our agriculture, industry, medicine, and so on. And we can have it as a technological choice rather than forced on us by nature. And so here's actually a little pop-up clinic that we funded from our carbon offset scheme, offsets. It is sardonically and deliberately located outside a large gleaming new government clinic which has been there for 3 years and never opened. This takes a day, a pickup truck, a woman with some implants, and a big queue of women, warned in advance, are waiting out a picture to get their implants. They are desperate for it. That's in Kenya. So how did the world respond to this obvious crying need to prioritize family planning? Well, with absolute indifference. Absolute indifference. There's the unmet need, growing the whole time, the need for family planning, rising bars, and the actual supply falling. So as I mentioned yesterday, the total, until 2012, 2 years ago, when the saintly Melinda Gates and the great and good Andrew Mitchell, with all these other faults, put their heads together and produced Family Planning 2020, aiming to halve the number, the 225 million women in the world with an unmet need for family planning. Until that time, total world aid for family planning was 10% of the Goldman Sachs bonus pot. As derisory a figure as that, and one cannot, I think, excessively criticize this appalling failure by the rest of the world. And the question is why? Why did this happen? Why are we so stupid as not to prioritize voluntary, non-coercive, but comprehensive family planning, women's education, women's empowerment programs to get the fertility rate down and stabilize as quickly as we possibly can by acceptable means, by ethical means, humane means. Well, first of all, of course, the Pope, this bizarre coalition formed in the late 70s and 80s, found full expression at the Cairo conference in '94, 20 years ago, led by the Pope, this monstrous, wicked doctrine on contraception that the Catholic Church is wedded to. One cannot be sufficiently critical. Here's a secret weapon. Men are a very large part of the problem. I could tell several stories about that from my diplomatic career. But the weapon of mass destruction, they like to, I won't go into the stories, they make my blood run. I don't have a picture of as it were, extreme feminists who have formed this bloc, which, in terms of Carter's original talk, are absolutely and implacably opposed to a woman's right to choose. Had a conversation with a leading light of that at the Royal Society, with one of those consultations before their big report. And I said, well, you start with the laws of physics, you reach a certain conclusion. And she said, yes, but if you start with women's rights, then you might get somewhere else. And I said, well, the trouble is, if the laws of women's rights conflict with the laws of physics, then there's no doubt which is going to win. And she walked away and has been telling everybody since that I am toxic, as is my organisation. Last and most insidiously, it's people like us. It's the liberal left. And we've got to deal with root cause global. Let's talk sustainability, energy, agriculture, population. Sorry, we don't talk about that. This politically correct sense that it is a nasty subject that decent people don't talk about has done immeasurable damage to the prospects of 225 million women in the world at least, and their poor children, because it's taken population out of the reasons for providing family planning and women's empowerment. The reasons left are purely women's rights and family health. It's a subset of health, and that's how population is defined in the aid budgets of the European Union and elsewhere. Population equals sexual and reproductive health and women's rights, full stop. And you can see tough, nasty African heads of government thinking, fine, health minister, get on with it, like malaria and TB and all the rest of it. Women's rights, yes, well, of course it's very important. Next item. It is not a serious, compelling case, whereas when you see that population growth, the David King slide, is a driver of every single problem these people face, from water through energy, food, blah, 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 you make a stronger case. And they won't do it, and we're almost the only people trying to do it. A handful of organisations like ours. So it's people like that, thanks. Anyway, here's some people who agree with us: Kofi Annan, Martin Luther King, the plague of overpopulation, UNICEF, great statement. Years ago, the guy got ticked off for putting it in the annual report, but there it is. Family planning could do more good for more people at less cost than any other technology. A pretty simple and clear statement. I could have added the Dalai Lama as well in there. The other great and good. Here's the reason I do all this stuff. It's my favourite person in the world. It's my little granddaughter. I exploit her charming image shamelessly. Subtext: I am not a racist. Pretty important. But I'm frightened. I do sometimes wake up at night and, agonizing about the world this kid's inheriting. And when she's my age, I know that every additional person she has to share that overcrowded and degrading planet with are going to lower her chances of a decent life. So, conclusions. Stabilizing population will increase total and average well-being, and since we're talking about the common good, this must be the common good. Conversely, consider the consequences of continued growth. It's a slow apocalypse. In my view, it started already in the Sahel, where I was at a conference in Ouagadougou a short time ago, 2 years ago, and saw the consequences of those rapidly increasing numbers of herdsmen moving south ahead of the advancing desert, accelerated by the rapidly increasing herds of sprawling animals, who run into rapidly increasing numbers of farmers still hacking and desertifying the soil because they don't re-nutrify, because they haven't got the money. and the cattle eat the crops, and the farmers kill the cattle, and the herdsmen raid the farmers, and they kill each other, and it's happening already. You know, all the way along the Sahel, there's a huge tragedy which I regard as almost completely inescapable. And still now I could tell stories from Rio about how everyone ignores the population angle there, although the Foreign Affairs Select Committee did produce a report earlier this year from Parliament pointing out population growth as a driver of instability in West Africa and the Sahel, and stating clearly that family planning was a necessary part of any solution to those problems of political instability. And in utilitarian terms, of course, we're looking at a slow apocalypse with monumental suffering already in training the Sahel. Reducing pain is as important as enhancing well-being. I suggest, again, it's important to reduce that pain by investing now in fewer people. The ethical imperative, therefore, it seems to me, is the highest priority to population stabilization by humane means before nature does it for us. And I hope that will be a primary conclusion of the report we eventually produce here. I also happen to have some papers, should you be interested, either electronically or in a paper, our own ethical paper, the Overshoot Index, ranking all the countries over 2 million people in terms of how much they are ecologically overshot already, according to the Global Footprint Network. Basic policy statement of our facts of our movement, recent research results, mostly in the UK, and the depopulation dividend, the positive advantages, the 18 reasons for a positive advantage in a declining population when you are seriously overshot.